Rich kids bullied a veteran single dad's son. But when his Green Beret brothers returned to town, what happened next forced those boys to their knees. Will courage and brotherhood be enough to protect a father and son against the power of money and fear? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Dawn crept through the worn curtains of the Carter household, painting shadows across the small kitchen where Ethan Carter stood at the stove. His practiced hands moved with military precision as he flipped pancakes, a skill perfected during countless mornings like this one. The kitchen, though modest, was spotless, a reflection of his years of discipline as a Green Beret. "Caleb, breakfast in 5, he called out, his deep voice carrying through their small home. The sizzle of the pancakes filled the silence that followed. Ethan glanced at the clock. 6:45 a.m., right on schedule. He'd learned that routines helped hold their world together, especially since Sarah's passing 2 years ago. The thought of his late wife made his chest tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. There wasn't time for grief now. The sound of shuffling feet drew his attention. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his school clothes slightly wrinkled, dark hair still messy from sleep. At 11, he was the spitting image of Sarah. Same gentle eyes, same artistic spirit. "Morning, Dad," Caleb mumbled, sliding into his usual chair at their small kitchen table. Ethan placed a plate of pancakes in front of his son. "Sleep okay, buddy?" Caleb poked at his breakfast with his fork. "I guess." Ethan noticed his son's hands trembling slightly as he cut into the pancakes. "First day jitters? What if they don't like me?" Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not, fancy enough?" Ethan pulled up a chair next to his son, his factory uniform crinkling as he Saturday. "Hey, look at me." He waited until Caleb's eyes met his. "You're a Carter. That means something. We might not have the biggest house or the fanciest clothes, but we've got something better. Character." Caleb managed a small smile, but Ethan could see the worry hadn't left his eyes. The move to this new town hadn't been easy on either of them, but the factory job paid better than anything back home. They needed the money, especially with Sarah's medical bills still looming. "Did Mom get nervous on her first days?" Caleb asked suddenly. The question caught Ethan off guard. He glanced at the photo on their refrigerator. Sarah in her favorite sundress, laughing at something off camera. "Your mom? She was the bravest person I knew. But yeah, she got nervous too. She used to say, 'Being nervous just means you care about doing things right.'" Caleb seemed to consider this, taking a bigger bite of his pancakes. "I wish she was here." "Me too, buddy." Ethan reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "Me too." They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger outside their windows. Ethan washed the dishes while Caleb packed his backpack, their movements synchronized by countless similar mornings. At 7:30, they climbed into Ethan's old pickup truck. The engine coughed to life, protesting slightly in the cool morning air. As they drove through town, the differences between their neighborhood and the area around the school became stark. Small houses gave way to manicured lawns and imposing gates. Luxury cars gleamed in circular driveways. Caleb pressed his face against the window, taking it all in. "Their houses are like castles. Different doesn't mean better," Ethan reminded him, though his own stomach churned at the disparity. He'd fought for his country alongside men from all walks of life. Money had never mattered in the heat of battle. But here, in this town, it seemed to matter more than anything. They pulled up to the school, a sprawling brick building with perfectly trimmed hedges and a fountain in the front courtyard. Students milled about in designer clothes, their backpacks spotless and new. Ethan parked the truck, aware of how out of place it looked among the luxury vehicles in the drop-off lane. "Got everything?" Caleb nodded, clutching his backpack, a simple blue one they'd bought on sale. "Remember what I taught you about situational awareness?" Ethan asked, falling back on his military training to mask his own anxiety. "Head up, shoulders back, be aware of my surroundings," Caleb recited. "That's my boy." Ethan managed to smile. "I'll be right here at 3 o'clock sharp." Caleb opened the door and slid out, adjusting his backpack. Ethan watched as his son walked toward the school entrance, where a group of well-dressed children stood chatting. They turned to look at Caleb, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something closer to contempt. Their designer clothes and perfectly styled hair made Caleb's modest attire stand out even more. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Every instinct told him to jump out of the truck to shield his son from those judgmental stares, but he knew he couldn't. Some battles Caleb would have to face on his own. The wealthy children whispered among themselves, their eyes following Caleb as he walked past them. One boy, wearing what looked like a custom-tailored uniform, nudged his friends and smirked. Ethan recognized that, look, he'd seen it plenty in his own school days, before the military had given him purpose and pride. As Caleb disappeared into the school building, Ethan forced himself to put the truck in gear. He had exactly 23 minutes to get to the factory before his shift started. The morning sun caught his rearview mirror, reflecting off the silver dog tags that hung there, a reminder of who he was and what he'd survived. "Watch over him, Sarah," he whispered, pulling away from the curb. "Watch over our boy." The autumn sun beat down on the school playground as Caleb Carter stood at its edge during lunch break. His worn sneakers scuffed against the pavement while he watched a group of boys playing basketball. Their expensive shoes squeaked on the court, and their laughter carried across the yard. Caleb's heart thumped in his chest as he inched closer to the game. He loved basketball, had played it countless times in their old neighborhood. The familiar bounce of the ball called to him like an old friend. "Hey," Caleb said softly, raising his hand in a small wave. "Can I play?" The game screeched to a halt. 5 boys turned to stare at him, their expressions a mix of surprise and amusement. At the center stood Mason Whitaker, his designer clothes and perfectly styled hair making him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Mason bounced the ball slowly, his eyes narrowing as they traveled from Caleb's face down to his feet. "Nice shoes," he smirked. "Where'd you get 'em? The dollar store?" Heat crept up Caleb's neck. His sneakers, bought from the thrift store last month, suddenly felt like they were made of lead. The other boys snickered, forming a loose circle around him. "Actually," Mason continued, taking a step closer, "my dad says there's a lot of people moving here from less fortunate areas." He pronounced the words carefully, like he was quoting someone. "Guess we know which category you fall into." Caleb's fingers curled around the straps of his second-hand backpack. The worn fabric suddenly felt like a bright sign advertising his family's struggles. "I just wanted to play," Caleb mumbled, trying to keep his voice steady like his dad had taught him. "Stand tall, son. Never let them see you're scared." Mason's smile widened. "Oh, you want to play?" He bounced the ball hard, letting it slam against the pavement inches from Caleb's feet. "Show us what you got then." Caleb reached for the ball, but Mason yanked it away, causing him to stumble forward. The circle of boys tightened. "Oops," Mason laughed. "Too slow. Maybe those cheap shoes are weighing you down." "Look at his backpack," another boy chimed in. "My little sister had one like that in kindergarten." The laughter grew louder. Caleb tried to step back, but someone shoved him from behind. He stumbled forward, straight into Mason, who pushed him hard. The ground rushed up to meet him. Caleb's knee scraped against the pavement, tearing through his jeans. Pain shot up his leg as rocks bit into his skin. "Ah, did the poor boy fall down?" Mason's voice dripped with fake concern. "Better be careful. Don't think your daddy can afford new jeans." Tears burned behind Caleb's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. The bell rang, and the boys dispersed, their laughter echoing across the playground. Caleb waited until they were gone before pulling himself up. His knee stung, blood seeping through the torn denim. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his leg as he limped to his next class. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Caleb kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Mason and his friends. When the final bell rang, he waited until most students had left before making his slow way home. That evening, Caleb sat across from his father at their small kitchen table. He pushed his peas around his plate, trying to ignore the throbbing in his knee. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan observed, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. His sharp eyes caught the slight wince as Caleb shifted in his chair. "What happened to your leg?" "Nothing," Caleb mumbled, keeping his eyes fixed on his plate. "Just fell during recess." "Let me see," Ethan said, his voice carrying that tone that meant it wasn't really a request. "Dad, it's fine," Caleb protested, but Ethan was already moving around the table. He knelt beside Caleb's chair, gently rolling up the torn jean leg. The scrape was angry and red, dried blood crusted around the edges. "This doesn't look like just a fall," Ethan said quietly. His eyes, trained by years of military service to spot trouble, studied his son's face. What really happened, Caleb? Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to tell his dad everything, about Mason's cruel words, about the pushing, about how much he missed their old home where he had friends. But the words wouldn't come. How could he admit that he wasn't strong enough to handle a few bullies? His dad was a Green Beret, a real hero. And here he was, getting pushed around on the playground. "I tripped," Caleb insisted, pulling his leg away. "It's no big deal." Ethan remained crouched beside him, his weathered face etched with concern. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Caleb nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on his dinner plate. "I know, Dad. I'm just tired. Can I be excused?" A long moment passed before Ethan stood up. "All right, buddy, but let's clean that knee first." As his father went to get the first aid kit, Caleb blinked hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. He wouldn't cry. He couldn't. He had to be strong, like his dad. But sitting there in their quiet kitchen, the laughter of Mason and his friends still rang in his ears, a haunting reminder that tomorrow would bring another day of trying to survive in a world where he didn't seem to belong. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school parking lot as Ethan's old pickup truck rumbled to a stop. Through his windshield, he watched a gleaming black SUV pull up to the curb ahead of them. The vehicle probably cost more than his annual salary. "That's Mason's dad's car," Caleb said quietly, shrinking a little in his seat. Ethan observed as a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out of the SUV, followed by Mason in his pristine school uniform. Other parents nearby straightened their postures, their conversations hushing as Mason's father passed. Some offered eager waves and overly bright smiles, like courtiers greeting royalty. "Remember what I always tell you," Ethan said, turning to his son. "Your worth isn't measured by what's in your wallet." Caleb nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on his lap. "I know, Dad." Ethan's heart ached at the defeat in his son's voice. He reached over to squeeze Caleb's shoulder. "Have a good day, buddy. I'll pick you up at 3. Caleb slipped out of the truck, his second-hand backpack hanging low on his shoulders. Ethan watched him walk toward the school entrance, noticing how he took the long way around to avoid passing Mason's group. Inside his first period class, Caleb slid into his seat near the back. He pulled out his notebook, trying to make himself as small as possible. But Mason's voice cut through the pre-class chatter like a knife. "Hey everyone, check this out." Mason held up his phone, his face lit with cruel excitement. "Watch what happened to the new kid yesterday." Caleb's stomach dropped as several students gathered around Mason's desk. The sound of his own yelp of surprise filled the room, followed by scattered laughter. On the tiny screen, yesterday's fall played out in vivid detail. His futile attempt to catch his balance, the way his knee scraped against the pavement, the look of shame on his face. "Did you see his face?" Mason snickered. "Like a scared little rabbit." Mrs. Thompson, their English teacher, glanced up from her desk. Her eyes met Caleb's for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in shuffling papers on her desk. Caleb's cheeks burned with humiliation. "Oh, is the army brat gonna cry?" Mason's voice dripped with mock concern. "Maybe Daddy can buy you some knee pads at the dollar store." The bell rang, and Mrs. Thompson finally stood up. "All right, class, phones away. Open your textbooks to page 83. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispers and pointing fingers. Every time Caleb walked down the hallway, he heard snippets of conversation about the new kid and that video. By the time the final bell rang, his shoulders felt heavy with the weight of countless stares. At home that evening, Caleb sat cross-legged on his bed, his math homework untouched beside him. In his hands, he held a silver picture frame, his thumb tracing the familiar curves of his mother's smile. The photo had been taken at the beach 3 years ago, before the cancer. Her arms were wrapped around a younger Caleb, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. "I miss you, Mom," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "I don't know what to do. Dad always says I need to be strong, but..." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I wish I could be brave like him." "Like you were." The sound of his father moving around in the kitchen drifted up through his open door. Caleb could picture him down there, probably reheating leftover casserole from their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. His dad tried so hard to make everything okay, worked so many hours at the factory. But Caleb could see the tiredness in his eyes. "I wish you were here," Caleb continued softly, touching the glass over his mother's face. "You always knew what to say when things got hard." His fingers trembled slightly as he held the frame closer. "I need to be stronger, Mom. I just don't know how." The setting sun painted his bedroom walls in shades of orange and pink, but Caleb barely noticed. He stayed there, cross-legged on his bed, holding the photo like a lifeline as the day's humiliation played over and over in his mind. His knee still stung from yesterday's fall, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. The factory break room hummed with the distant sound of machinery. Ethan sat alone at a corner table, mechanically eating his sandwich while his thoughts drifted to Caleb. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty chairs around him. His co-workers chatted in their usual groups, their laughter feeling distant and foreign. He barely registered the heavy door swinging open, too lost in worry about his son's silence at breakfast. But a familiar voice cut through his thoughts like a bolt of lightning. "Well, if it isn't Carter," still looking as serious as ever. Ethan's head snapped up. There, grinning broadly in civilian clothes, stood Sergeant Luis Morales. The sandwich dropped from Ethan's hands as he shot to his feet. "Sergeant?" Ethan's voice cracked with surprise. Luis's warm laugh filled the room. "Come here, brother." He opened his arms wide. The two men embraced firmly, patting each other's backs with the familiar rhythm of soldiers who'd shared more than just battlefield stories. When they pulled apart, Ethan noticed the slight gray at Luis's temples, the new wrinkles around his eyes, changes that spoke of the years since they'd last met. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, gesturing for Luis to sit. Luis pulled up a chair, his movements still carrying that military precision. "Moved back last month. My sister's here, and after Mary had our second kid, we wanted to settle somewhere quieter." He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Been meaning to look you up, brother. Heard through the grapevine you were working here." Ethan nodded, something tight in his chest beginning to loosen. Just seeing a familiar face from his unit made him feel less alone. "It's good work. Keeps food on the table. How's your boy?" Luis asked, his dark eyes watchful. "Caleb must be, 11 now?" "Yeah." Ethan's smile faded slightly. He's having a rough time." Luis waited patiently as Ethan gathered his thoughts. Around them, other workers began filtering out as lunch break wound down, but neither man moved. "We moved here for a fresh start," Ethan continued, his voice low. "After Sarah, after we lost her, staying in our old town was too hard. But Caleb's struggling at his new school. There's this group of kids." He clenched his fist on the table. "Rich kids?" Luis asked knowingly. "Yeah. Their ringleader's father practically owns the town." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "They're making Caleb's life hell, and the school won't do anything about it. Yesterday, he came home with scrapes on his knee, trying to hide it from me." Luis's jaw tightened. "Some battles don't end when we leave the service, do they?" "I feel powerless, Luis." Ethan's admission came out barely above a whisper. "In combat, I knew what to do. But this, watching my son suffer and not being able to fix it?" He shook his head. "I'm failing him." "Hey!" Luis's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's forearm. "You're not failing anyone. You're fighting a different kind of war now, but you're not fighting it alone anymore." Ethan met his old friend's gaze, seeing the same determination he'd witnessed countless times in the field. "Remember what we used to say in the unit?" Luis's voice carried the weight of shared history. "Leave no man behind. That didn't end when we took off the uniform, brother. Your fight is my fight." "Luis, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm telling." Luis's grip tightened. "We're Green Berets, Carter. We look after our own, and that includes their families." A warmth Ethan hadn't felt in months spread through his chest. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Give me your phone," Luis said, pulling out his own. They exchanged numbers quickly. "I'm just across town. Whatever you and Caleb need, I'm there. And I know a few other brothers who'd say the same." The factory bell rang, signaling the end of lunch break. Both men stood, but Luis wasn't finished. "You're a good father, Ethan. Sarah would be proud of how you're raising that boy." He squeezed Ethan's shoulder, Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when we need it." They embraced once more before parting. As Luis headed for the door, he turned back. "I mean it, Carter. One call, day or night. Brotherhood doesn't end after war." Ethan watched his friend leave, feeling as though a heavy weight had lifted slightly from his shoulders. The afternoon shift passed in a blur, and when he finally climbed into his truck to head home, his spirit felt lighter than it had in weeks. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Ethan pulled into his driveway. Through the living room window, he could see Caleb sitting at his homework desk. His son's shoulders were still slumped, but Ethan felt a new determination rising in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Caleb. Ethan grabbed his lunchbox and jacket, squaring his shoulders as he walked to the front door. When he stepped inside, Caleb looked up from his textbook. "Hey, Dad," his son said quietly. "Hey, buddy." Ethan crossed the room and pulled Caleb into a tight hug, holding on a moment longer than usual. "How about we make some spaghetti for dinner? Your mom's recipe?" For the first time that week, a small smile tugged at Caleb's lips. "Really?" "Really." Ethan ruffled his son's hair, love and protective determination surging through his heart. "Come on, you can help me with the sauce." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows on a quiet Saturday morning. Caleb stood in his pajamas, staring at the bright yellow flyer taped to the refrigerator. His fingers traced the bold letters announcing Annual Spring Talent Show, while the smell of his dad's coffee filled the kitchen. The paper crinkled slightly under his touch. Last year's show flashed through his memory. Mason Whitaker performing a perfectly choreographed hip-hop routine with his expensive dance crew, the audience cheering wildly. Caleb had sat in the back row then, trying to make himself invisible. Ethan watched his son from the kitchen table, noting how Caleb's shoulders tensed as he read the flyer. "Something catch your eye there, buddy?" Caleb startled slightly, dropping his hand. "Oh, He shifted his weight from foot to foot, a habit Ethan recognized from when his son was nervous. "Just looking at the talent show thing." "Yeah." Ethan took a careful sip of his coffee, keeping his tone casual. "What do you think about it?" Caleb shrugged, but his fingers found the edge of the flyer again. "I don't know." He paused, gathering courage. "I was thinking maybe I could sing something." The words came out barely above a whisper. Ethan set his coffee mug down slowly, remembering how Sarah used to sing Caleb to sleep every night. Their son had inherited her voice, though he rarely used it anymore. "That sounds like a great idea," Ethan said warmly. Caleb turned around, surprise written across his face. "Really? But—" His expression fell. "Mason always wins. He's already telling everyone about his new dance routine." His dad hired professional choreographers and everything. Ethan pushed his chair back and patted the seat next to him. "Come here for a minute, son." Caleb patted over in his sock feet and slid into the chair. The morning sun caught the worry in his eyes. "You know what real bravery is?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. Caleb thought for a moment. "Like what you did in the army?" Ethan smiled. "That's one kind, but bravery comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is share your voice when you're scared. But what if they laugh at me?" Caleb's voice quavered. "What if I mess up? Then you'll know you had the courage to try." Ethan reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder. "That's worth more than any trophy Mason Whitaker could ever win." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a small spark of hope. "Mom used to sing Bridge Over Troubled Water. I know all the words. Want to practice?" Ethan stood up, extending his hand. Living rooms got better acoustics anyway. Caleb hesitated for just a moment before taking his father's hand. They moved to the living room, where morning light painted warm patches on the worn carpet. Sarah's old piano stood against the wall, untouched since she passed. "Can we record it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "So I can hear how it sounds?" Smart thinking. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the recording app. "Whenever you're ready, buddy." Caleb closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The first few notes came out shaky, but as the familiar words flowed, his voice grew stronger. Sarah's voice echoed in every note. The same gentle power, the same ability to make the world feel a little softer. "When you're weary, feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I'll dry them all." Ethan stood perfectly still. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as parents and students filled the rows of seats. Stage lights cast a warm glow across the polished floor. and handwritten signs decorated the walls. Backstage, performers adjusted costumes and practiced last-minute moves. Mason Whitaker stood in the center of a group of admirers, wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly salary. His perfectly styled hair gleamed under the lights as he demonstrated a dance move. "My choreographer worked with actual hip-hop stars," Mason bragged loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Dad flew him in, specially from Los Angeles." Caleb huddled in a corner, clutching his sheet music. His hands trembled slightly as he watched Mason command attention. The simple button-up shirt Ethan had ironed for him suddenly felt inadequate compared to Mason's outfit. Ethan squeezed through the crowded backstage area to reach his son. "How are you doing, buddy?" "I don't know if I can do this, Dad." Caleb's voice was barely audible over the pre-show chaos. Ethan knelt down to eye level with his son. "Remember what we practiced? Just focus on the music like when we sing at home. The rest doesn't matter." The stage manager, a harried-looking teacher, called for everyone's attention. 5 minutes until showtime. Parents, please take your seats." Ethan gave Caleb's shoulder one last squeeze. "I'm proud of you, son, no matter what happens." As Ethan made his way to his seat, he caught Mason smirking at Caleb. The boy's expression reminded him of a predator sizing up its prey. The talent show opened with a flurry of acts, juggling, magic tricks, and dance routines. Mason's performance came early in the program. His crew of backup dancers moved in perfect synchronization while he commanded center stage, every move precise and practiced. The audience erupted in applause when he finished, and Mason bowed with practiced grace. Finally, the announcer called Caleb's name. The walk from backstage to the microphone seemed to take forever. Caleb looked tiny under the bright lights, his sheet music rustling in his shaking hands. The piano accompaniment began, and Caleb's voice quivered on the first few notes. From his seat, Ethan could see his son's knuckles white against the paper he held. But then something changed. Caleb closed his eyes, just like they'd practiced at home, and his voice grew stronger. The song was one his mother used to sing, a gentle melody about finding light in darkness. As Caleb's clear voice filled the auditorium, a hush fell over the audience. Even the restless younger siblings stopped fidgeting. Ethan felt his chest tighten with pride and grief. Sarah would have loved to see this moment. When the last note faded, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. It wasn't the thunderous response Mason had received, but it was genuine and warm. Caleb opened his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips as he gave a quick bow. The smile didn't last long. As Caleb made his way backstage, Mason's voice cut through the crowd. "Nice try, Charity Case. Did you get that shirt from the donation bin?" Ethan found Caleb in the hallway after the show, while families were still milling around the lobby taking photos. "You did amazing out there," Ethan said, pulling his son into a hug. "That took real courage." "Mason's going to win again," Caleb mumbled into his father's shirt. "He always does." "Hey." Ethan pulled back to look at his son. "Winning isn't everything. What you did up there, sharing your gift even though you were scared, that matters more than any trophy." Caleb nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Can we go home now? I need to thank Mrs. Peterson for accompanying you on piano. Wait here by the water fountain, okay? I'll be right back." Caleb leaned against the wall near the fountain, watching other families celebrate with flowers and hugs. He didn't notice Mason and his friends approaching until they had him surrounded. "Look who it is," Mason sneered, holding up his phone. "The singing orphan." "I'm not an orphan," Caleb said quietly, trying to step away. But Mason's friends blocked his path. "Might as well be. Everyone knows your dad can barely afford to feed you." Mason's phone was recording now, its red light blinking like an evil eye. "Tell us, Charity Case, did you have to dumpster dive for that sheet music?" The other boys laughed on cue, their phones also raised to capture Caleb's humiliation. "My mom taught me that song," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh, right, your dead mom." Mason's voice dripped with fake sympathy. "I guess that's why you sound so sad when you sing, like a little lost puppy nobody wants." Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes. He pushed past the circle of laughing boys and ran, their taunts following him down the hallway. His feet carried him out of the school and into the dark parking lot, past the row of luxury cars where Mason's chauffeur waited. He ran all the way home, lungs burning, the sound of his own sobs drowning out the traffic. Behind him, Mason was already uploading the video, adding cruel captions and tags that would ensure everyone at school would see it by morning. When Ethan returned to the water fountain minutes later, his son was gone. A janitor mentioned seeing a boy run out crying, and Ethan's heart sank. He rushed to his truck, already dreading what he might find when he got home. The chapter ends with Caleb crying in his room, while his humiliation spreads across social media, transforming a moment of courage into ammunition for cruelty. The morning sun filtered through worn curtains in the Carter kitchen, casting pale shadows across the breakfast table. 2 bowls of cereal sat untouched, one in front of Ethan, who watched his son with growing concern, and one before Caleb, who hadn't lifted his head since sitting down. "I can't go back there," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Everyone's seen it." Ethan's heart ached as he watched his son push the cereal bowl away. Dark circles shadowed Caleb's eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent worrying about the video that had spread through the school's social media like wildfire. "Son, look at me," Ethan said gently. When Caleb finally raised his eyes, the pain there made Ethan's stomach clench. "Those boys, what they did, that's on them, not you." "But everyone's laughing at me." Caleb's shoulders hunched forward. "They're calling me charity case in all the comments. Mason's friends keep sharing it and adding mean stuff." Ethan gripped his coffee mug tighter, trying to contain the anger that burned in his chest. He'd spent hours last night trying to get the video taken down, but it kept popping up on different accounts. The image of his son being surrounded, mocked, and filmed made his blood boil. "Maybe," Caleb's voice trembled. "Maybe if we had more money, or if I had better clothes." "Stop right there." Ethan's voice came out sharper than he intended, and he softened his tone. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing." But Caleb just stared at his lap, tears dropping onto his worn jeans. Ethan felt helpless, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his days in combat. Back then, he'd always had his team, his brothers in arms, who had his back. Now, watching his son suffer, he felt completely alone. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, reminding Ethan that school would start soon. He should be pushing Caleb to get ready, to face the day with courage. But looking at his son's defeated posture, he couldn't bring himself to do it. "Okay, buddy," Ethan said softly. "Not today. We'll figure something out." Relief flooded Caleb's face, followed quickly by shame at that relief. He pushed away from the table and retreated to his room, leaving Ethan alone with his cold coffee and colder thoughts. Ethan rubbed his face with his calloused hands, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. Sarah would have known what to do. His late wife had always been better at handling emotional situations, at finding the right words to heal hurt feelings. His phone sat on the counter, and after a moment's hesitation, he picked it up. Luis's number was still in his recent calls from yesterday. His finger hovered over it before pressing dial. The phone rang twice before Luis's warm voice answered. "Hermano, how are you holding up?" "Not good, Luis." Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "Caleb won't go to school. That video, it's everywhere." "I saw it," Luis replied, his tone darkening. "Those little punks had no right." "I don't know what to do." Ethan walked to the window, watching the neighbor kids climb onto their school bus. "I can't fight this like I would have in the field. Can't protect him from this kind of warfare." "Maybe that's where you're wrong, brother." Luis's voice took on the tone Ethan remembered from mission planning sessions. "Remember what made us strong in the field?" "The team," Ethan replied automatically. "Exactly. We've got brothers right here in town. Johnson's running that hardware store on Main. Rodriguez teaches at the community college. Martinez has that construction company." Hope stirred in Ethan's chest for the first time since seeing that video. "You think they'd help?" "They're Green Berets, hermano. Once a brother, always a brother. Let me make some calls." Ethan heard the familiar sound of Luis's chair creaking as he leaned forward, his planning pose. "We protect our own, Ethan. And Caleb, he's family too. What do you have in mind?" "First, we show Caleb he's not alone. Then we remind this town what real strength looks like. Not bullying and money, but honor and brotherhood." The spark of hope in Ethan's chest grew stronger. He glanced toward Caleb's room, where soft music played behind the closed door. "Make those calls, Luis. Please. Already on it, brother. We'll meet tonight, your place. 7 o'clock. After hanging up, Ethan walked to Caleb's room and knocked softly. "Can I come in?" A muffled "yeah" came from inside. Ethan opened the door to find Caleb lying on his bed, headphones around his neck, staring at the ceiling. The photo of Sarah, on his nightstand, seemed to watch over him. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. "You know what got me through the toughest times when I was a soldier?" Caleb turned his head slightly, curious despite his misery. "My brothers. Not by blood, but by choice. Men who stood by me when things got dark." Ethan placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "And you know what? They're still here, still ready to stand with us." "Really?" Caleb's voice was small but held a hint of interest. "Really?" Ethan squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "We're not alone anymore, buddy. Not by a long shot." For the first time that morning, Caleb's eyes held something besides fear, a tiny glimmer of hope that matched the spark in Ethan's own heart. The aroma of grilled meat and wood smoke filled Luis's backyard as the evening sun painted the sky in warm oranges and pinks. Ethan stood by the grill with Luis, watching his old friend flip burgers with practiced ease. The familiar sizzle and pop brought back memories of base camp cookouts, where brotherhood meant sharing whatever food they had. Caleb sat quietly at the picnic table, his shoulders still tense but his eyes curious as he watched the gathering of veterans. The wooden table was weathered but solid, much like the men who now surrounded it. "Marcus and Daniel should be here any minute," Luis said, checking his watch. "Marcus is bringing his famous potato salad." As if on cue, the gate creaked open. Marcus Turner's imposing figure filled the entrance, his broad shoulders and military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Behind him, Daniel Brooks moved with a slight limp, but his gentle smile lit up his face. "Look who finally decided to show up," Luis called out, grinning. Marcus held up a large bowl. "You try making potato salad while running a security company, Morales." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion as his old teammates approached. It had been years since they'd all been together like this. Marcus gave him a bone-crushing hug while Daniel offered a quieter but equally warm embrace. "And this must be Caleb," Marcus said, turning to the boy at the table. His voice, usually commanding, softened as he extended his hand. "Your dad used to talk about you all the time during deployment." Caleb shook Marcus's hand, his own looking small in comparison. "Really?" "Oh, yeah," Daniel chimed in, taking a seat across from Caleb. "He'd show us your drawings whenever mail came in, kept them in his pocket during missions for good luck." A hint of pride crossed Caleb's face as he glanced at his father. Ethan hadn't known his son was aware of those small acts of love during deployment. Luis began serving the food, the paper plates loaded with burgers and Marcus's potato salad. The men fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, sharing stories that made Caleb lean forward with interest. "Your dad ever tell you about the time he carried me 2 miles through mountain terrain?" Daniel asked, his eyes twinkling. "Taliban had us pinned down. I took a hit in the leg. Your father wouldn't leave me behind, even when I ordered him to. That's what we do," Marcus added, his deep voice serious. "We stand by our brothers no matter what. No man left behind isn't just a saying, it's a promise." Caleb looked at his father with new eyes. "Was it scary?" "Terrifying," Ethan admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But sometimes being brave means doing what's right, especially when you're scared. Like singing in the talent show," Luis said, giving Caleb a knowing look. "That took real courage, mijo." Caleb ducked his head, but there was a small smile on his face. The veterans exchanged glances, seamlessly shifting the conversation to lighter topics while keeping Caleb engaged. As the evening progressed, Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Caleb, we've heard about what's been happening at school." When Caleb tensed, Marcus continued, "And we want you to know something important. You're not alone in this fight." "We've all faced bullies," Daniel added softly. "Different kinds, maybe, but bullies nonetheless. The key is not letting them define who you are." "But they're stronger than me," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And richer. Everyone listens to them." "Strength isn't about money or size," Marcus said firmly. "It's about character, about standing tall when others try to push you down." Luis nodded, passing around a plate of cookies. "We're thinking, if your dad agrees, we could start teaching you some things. Not fighting," he added quickly, seeing Ethan's concern, "but confidence, self-defense, the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are." "Like what?" Caleb asked, interest sparking in his eyes. Daniel smiled. Well, I teach yoga now. Helps with balance and focus. Marcus here knows all about standing your ground without throwing a punch. Luis is great with public speaking. And your dad? Marcus added. He's got the kind of leadership that makes others want to follow. Not because they have to, but because they trust him. Ethan watched as his son straightened slightly in his chair, absorbing the respect these battle-hardened men showed him. It wasn't pity in their eyes. It was recognition of potential. We're not just your dad's old war buddies, Luis said, his voice warm. We're family, and family takes care of its own. The conversation flowed naturally after that, with each man sharing bits of wisdom wrapped in stories that had Caleb alternating between laughter and amazement. They talked about honor, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the power of standing together. As the sky darkened and stars began to appear, Caleb's eyes grew heavy despite his obvious desire to stay awake. Ethan noticed and checked his watch. Time to head home, buddy. You've got school tomorrow. For the first time since the video incident, Caleb didn't flinch at the mention of school. Instead, he stood and thanked each man with a newfound confidence in his handshake. The drive home was quiet but comfortable. Caleb stared out the window, lost in thought, while Ethan navigated the familiar streets. When they arrived home, Caleb paused at the foot of the stairs. Dad? Yeah, son, those guys, they're pretty amazing. Ethan smiled. That they are. And they really want to help me? More than you know. They see in you what I see. A brave kid who just needs to remember how strong he already island. Caleb nodded, then surprised Ethan by giving him a quick, fierce hug before heading upstairs to bed. Through his open door, Ethan could see him carefully placing the photo of his mother on the nightstand, smoothing the corners with gentle fingers. Good night, Dad, Caleb called out, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Good night, buddy. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his son getting ready for bed. For the first time since the video incident, his shoulders felt lighter. The smile that spread across his face wasn't forced or worried. It was real, born of hope, and the knowledge that change was possible, not just because of his old teammates' support, but because he'd seen something awaken in Caleb tonight, pride in being his father's son. The autumn sun warmed the grass at Memorial Park as Caleb stood surrounded by 4 military veterans. Their presence formed a protective circle around him, not of intimidation but of strength and support. Luis adjusted Caleb's stance, while Marcus and Daniel watched with encouraging nods. Remember, buddy, Luis said, his voice gentle but firm. It starts with how you carry yourself. He demonstrated, shoulders back, chin level with the ground. Your body language tells others how to treat you. Caleb tried to mirror Luis's posture, though his shoulders kept wanting to curl inward from habit. Ethan watched from a nearby bench, his heart swelling with pride at his son's determination. That's it, Marcus chimed in, his deep voice carrying across the park. Now walk toward that tree like you own this place. Caleb took a hesitant step, then another. Daniel called out, Imagine you're wearing a cape like Superman. Let it flow behind you. This made Caleb laugh, his steps becoming more natural. The veterans exchanged knowing looks. Laughter was always the first breakthrough. Now, Luis continued, let's work on your stance. If someone tries to push you. He demonstrated a stable position, feet shoulder-width apart. Plant yourself like an oak tree. For the next hour, they practiced simple movements. Nothing aggressive, just ways to stand ground, to deflect unwanted contact, to move with purpose. The veterans shared stories between exercises, making Caleb feel part of something bigger than himself. You know, Marcus said during a water break, I was the smallest kid in my class, once. He winked at Caleb. But I learned that size doesn't matter nearly as much as heart. Daniel nodded, adjusting his leg brace. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. But walk away proud, not scared. Caleb absorbed every word, his eyes bright with newfound confidence. When they practiced walking again, his steps had changed. No longer shuffling, but purposeful. Look at that, Luis whispered to Ethan. Your boy's got natural grace. Ethan couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Watching these men, who'd faced war alongside him, now helping his son fight his own battles, it moved him beyond words. The afternoon wore on with more exercises, but also with jokes and stories. Caleb learned about the time Marcus got lost during training and ended up in a cow pasture. Daniel shared how he once accidentally saluted a vending machine, thinking it was an officer in the dark. "Dad?" Caleb called out, laughing at another of Luis's stories. "Did you really eat bugs during survival training?" Ethan grinned, joining the group. "Those were gourmet bugs, son. Very exclusive menu." The laughter that followed was interrupted by the sound of an expensive engine. A black SUV cruised past the park, slowing near their group. Through the tinted windows, Mason's face was visible, his expression dark as he observed the training session. But Caleb, caught up in the camaraderie of the moment, barely noticed. He was too busy practicing a defensive stance while Daniel told another funny story about basic training. The veterans had positioned themselves naturally between Caleb and the street, a subtle shield born of years of protective instinct. "Hey, Mr. Daniel," Caleb said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Can you show me that blocking move again?" "Sure thing, kiddo," Daniel replied, his eyes briefly tracking the SUV as it accelerated away. "Remember, it's all about confidence. You've got more power than you know." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of movement and laughter. They wrapped up with a group photo, Caleb in the middle, standing tall between his father and their veteran friends. His smile was different now, not the nervous one from before, but genuine and strong. As they packed up their water bottles and training gear, Luis caught Ethan's eye. "Same time next week?" Ethan nodded, watching Caleb chat animatedly with Marcus about comic book heroes. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The park was bathed in golden light as they gathered their things. Caleb's walk back to the car was steady, his head held high. The change wasn't just physical. There was a new light in his eyes, a spark of self-belief that hadn't been there before. The black SUV passed by once more, moving slower this time. Mason sat in the passenger seat, his phone raised, recording their group. The veterans noticed but didn't react, keeping their focus on Caleb's training. They'd faced worse threats than a privileged kid with a smartphone. Monday dawned crisp and clear as Caleb walked through the school's main entrance. His shoulders were set differently now, just as Lewis had taught him. Each step carried purpose, his chin lifted slightly, not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. The hallway seemed different somehow, less threatening than before. Near his locker, he heard the familiar sound of taunting. His heart quickened, but not from fear this time. Around the corner, two of Mason's friends towered over a sixth grader named Tommy, a small boy with thick glasses who always sat alone at lunch. "Hey, Four Eyes," one of the bullies sneered, knocking Tommy's books from his hands. "Why don't you clean our shoes while you're down there?" Caleb remembered Marcus's words from the park. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up for someone else. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Leave him alone," Caleb said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He positioned himself between Tommy and the bullies, feet planted just as he practiced. The bullies exchanged surprised looks. They were used to the old Caleb, the one who would hurry past with lowered eyes. "What's it to you, Carter?" the taller one asked. But Caleb noticed the uncertainty in his voice. "Tommy's with me," Caleb said simply, helping the younger boy gather his books. "And if you've got a problem with that, we can talk to Principal Stevens about it." He maintained eye contact, remembering Daniel's advice about not showing fear. Mrs. Rodriguez, his English teacher, rounded the corner just then. She paused, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows. The bullies shuffled away, muttering under their breath. "You okay?" Caleb asked Tommy, who nodded vigorously, clutching his books to his chest. "Thanks," Tommy whispered. "Nobody's ever. I mean, would you maybe want to sit together at lunch?" Caleb smiled. "Sure, I'd like that." Throughout the morning, word spread about what had happened. Teachers noticed how Caleb participated more in class, raising his hand to answer questions. During third period, Miss Rodriguez pulled him aside. "Caleb," she said warmly, "I've seen quite a change in you lately. The way you helped Tommy this morning, that took real character." Caleb felt his cheeks warm. "My dad and his friends have been teaching me about standing up for what's right." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes lit up. "Your father was in the military, wasn't he? Actually, I've been looking for a student speaker for our Veterans Day Assembly next week. Would you be interested in sharing a few words about what you've learned from your father's service?" Caleb's heart jumped. Speaking in front of the whole school? A month ago, he would have declined immediately. But now, thinking of his dad and the Green Berets who had shown him such kindness, he found himself nodding. "I'd be honored," he said. "Wonderful. Please let your father know he's specially invited to attend. We'd love to have him there." That afternoon, Caleb could barely contain his excitement as he waited for his father's truck in the pickup line. As soon as he climbed in, the words tumbled out. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to speak at the Veterans Day Assembly. She wants you to come too." Ethan's face broke into a proud smile. "That's amazing, buddy. What made her choose you?" Caleb told him about standing up for Tommy, watching his father's eyes grow misty with pride. "You know what?" Ethan said, pulling out his phone. "We should tell the guys about this." They drove straight to Luis's house, where they found him working in his garage. One quick phone call brought Marcus and Daniel over within minutes. "A Veterans Day speech?" Luis grinned, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "Now that's something special." "You'll knock it out of the park, kid," Marcus added. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "We'll all be there. Front row." "Really?" Caleb's eyes widened. "All of you? Try and stop us," Luis laughed. "Green Berets stick together, and that includes our families." Ethan watched his son beaming under the attention of these strong men who had become like uncles to him. The change in Caleb over the past weeks wasn't just in his posture or his confidence, it was in his heart. He was learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. "How about we help you practice that speech?" Daniel suggested. "Between the four of us, we've got some stories that might inspire a few good lines." The men gathered around the garage workbench, sharing memories and lessons learned while Caleb scribbled notes. Ethan stood back, taking in the scene. His son was surrounded by heroes, men who had faced far worse than schoolyard bullies and emerged stronger. Now they were passing that strength on to the next generation. As the afternoon light began to fade, each veteran made his pledge to attend the assembly. They would come in uniform, they decided, a visible reminder of the brotherhood that had helped transform a timid boy into someone who stood up for others. "1 week," Luis said, giving Caleb a gentle fist bump. "You've got this, soldier." Caleb stood tall, surrounded by his father's brothers in arms. No longer the scared kid who had once hidden from his tormentors. He was his father's son, and now he had an entire team of heroes backing him up. The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement on Veterans Day morning. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the walls, and hand-painted banners thanked service members for their sacrifice. American flags of various sizes decorated every corner, their stars and stripes a proud reminder of what the day represented. Ethan Carter sat in the front row alongside Luis, Marcus, and Daniel, all wearing their dress uniforms. They had polished every button and badge until they gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The bleachers behind them filled quickly with parents, teachers, and students, their chatter echoing off the high ceiling. In the prep room adjacent to the gym, Caleb paced back and forth, his index cards trembling slightly in his hands. He wore his best clothes, a crisp white shirt, navy blue tie, and pressed khaki pants that his dad had helped him pick out. The words he'd practiced so many times swirled in his mind. Principal Stevens's voice boomed through the microphone, welcoming everyone to the assembly. "Today, we honor those who have served our country with courage and distinction," she announced. "And now, I'd like to introduce a very special student speaker, Caleb Carter, who will share some thoughts about what military service means to him." Caleb took a deep breath, squared his shoulders just as Luis had taught him, and walked onto the stage. The spotlight felt warm on his face as he approached the podium. His eyes found his father in the crowd, and the sight of those 4 proud veterans in their uniforms gave him strength. "Good morning," Caleb began, his voice clear and steady. "When Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to speak today, I thought about what courage really means. I used to think it was about being the strongest or the loudest." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "But my dad taught me differently." In the third row, Mason Whitaker slumped in his seat, arms crossed, but Caleb didn't let that distract him. "My father served as a Green Beret, one of the most elite soldiers in our military. But when I asked him what made him brave, he didn't talk about fighting. He talked about his brothers, the men who served beside him." Caleb gestured to the 4 veterans in the front row. "He told me that true courage is about standing up for others, even when you're scared." Ethan's eyes glistened as he watched his son speak. Luis reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "These men taught me that honor isn't about being perfect," Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about getting back up when you fall. It's about defending those who can't defend themselves. And most importantly, it's about treating everyone with respect, even people who might not show you the same kindness." Several teachers dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Even some of the students who usually paid little attention sat up straighter, caught by the sincerity in Caleb's words. My dad lost my mom 3 years ago, but he never stopped being brave. Every day he shows me what sacrifice looks like. He works long hours at the factory, helps me with my homework, and still finds time to teach me about character. Caleb's voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. That's what our veterans do. They sacrifice so others can have better lives. In the audience, Mrs. Rodriguez beamed with pride. She noticed several of Mason's friends shifting uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps reflecting on their own behavior. These men beside my father today, Caleb gestured again to the veterans. They've become my uncles. They showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands beside you when times are tough. They taught me that sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with kindness and integrity. Ethan couldn't hold back his tears now. Daniel passed him a handkerchief, while Marcus and Luis sat tall, their own eyes misty with emotion. So today, when we honor our veterans, we're not just thanking them for fighting wars. We're thanking them for showing us how to live with dignity, how to protect what's right, and how to lift others up instead of pushing them down. Caleb's voice rang clear through the gymnasium. Thank you, Dad, for being my hero. And thank you to all veterans who remind us that true strength comes from serving others. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Students and parents rose to their feet, creating a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Principal Stevens wiped her eyes before returning to the microphone, her voice thick with emotion as she thanked Caleb. As Caleb descended the stage steps, Ethan met him halfway. Father and son embraced tightly, neither caring about the tears that fell freely now. The other Green Berets surrounded them, forming a protective circle of pride and love. That's my boy, Ethan whispered into Caleb's hair. That's my brave boy. Near the back of the bleachers, Mason Whitaker slumped lower in his seat, his face a mix of anger and something else, perhaps the first stirrings of shame. But neither Caleb nor Ethan noticed him. They were too wrapped up in their moment of triumph, surrounded by the men who had helped them find their strength again. The applause continued to thunder through the gymnasium, a standing tribute not just to veterans, but to a young boy who had found his voice and the father who had helped him discover his courage. The autumn evening had turned chilly as Ethan pulled into their driveway after work. Golden leaves skittered across the walkway, and the setting sun cast long shadows across their modest front yard. His muscles ached from another long shift at the factory, but thoughts of Caleb's triumphant speech that morning kept a smile on his face. As he climbed the front steps, something white caught his eye. An official-looking envelope lay propped against the screen door, bearing the seal of the state government. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he picked it up, his calloused fingers suddenly clumsy as he tore it open. The paper inside felt heavy, formal. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, and the world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The words, Child Protective Services, and Formal Investigation jumped out at him like accusations. The complaint, filed by Theodore Whitaker, Mason's father, alleged that Ethan's military background and possible PTSD made him potentially unstable and unfit for sole custody. Ethan's hands began to shake. The letter mentioned concerning reports about his militant approach to parenting and involving military personnel in his son's affairs. They had twisted everything, the mentorship, the confidence training, all of it, into something sinister. He stumbled through the front door, the letter crumpling in his grip. The house was quiet except for the sound of Caleb's footsteps. Upstairs, the boy's humming drifted down. He was still riding high from his success at the assembly. The sound made Ethan's chest ache. In the kitchen, Ethan slumped into a chair, spreading the letter on the worn tablecloth. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. They couldn't take Caleb away. They couldn't. The boy was all he had left of Sarah, all that kept him going some days. Dad? Caleb's voice came from the doorway. Are you okay? Ethan quickly tried to fold the letter, but Caleb had already seen it. The boy's keen eyes, so like his mother's, caught the official letterhead. What's that? Caleb asked, stepping closer. Nothing, buddy. Just some paperwork. Ethan attempted a smile, but it felt wrong on his face. Caleb moved faster than Ethan expected, snatching the letter before his father could stop him. His eyes widened as he read, his face growing paler with each line. They want to take me away?" Caleb's voice cracked. The paper trembled in his hands. "Because of Mason's dad? No one's taking you anywhere," Ethan said firmly, standing up. But his own voice wavered slightly. It's because I spoke up, isn't it?" Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "If I hadn't given that speech?" "Stop right there." Ethan crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. This is about rich men who don't like being stood up to, that's all." But Caleb was sobbing now, his thin shoulders shaking. "I don't want to leave you, Dad. Please don't let them take me." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He held his son tighter, feeling the boy's tears soaking through his work shirt. Everything they'd built, the confidence, the sense of security, the pride, seemed to crumble around them. "Remember what we learned from Uncle Luis?" Ethan whispered into Caleb's hair. "About never leaving a brother behind?" Caleb nodded against his chest. "Well, you're more than my brother, Caleb. You're my son, and I will never, ever leave you behind. You understand?" Another nod, smaller this time. They stood like that for a long time, until Caleb's sobs quieted to hiccups. The kitchen grew dark around them, but neither moved to turn on the lights. Sometimes, Ethan thought, the darkness made it easier to be brave. Finally, Caleb pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "What do we do now?" Ethan wished he had a better answer. The truth was, he felt more scared than he had in any combat situation, but he couldn't let Caleb see that fear. "First," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "we have dinner, then homework. We keep living our lives because we have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." "But what about?" Caleb gestured at the crumpled letter on the table. "We'll handle it. I promise you that." Ethan squeezed his son's shoulder. "Now, how about you help me make some mac and cheese?" The evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. They ate dinner, though neither was very hungry. Caleb worked on his math homework while Ethan pretended to read the newspaper, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. When bedtime came, Caleb didn't protest as he usually did. He changed into his pajamas silently, his movements heavy with worry. Ethan followed their usual routine, checking that teeth were brushed, making sure the nightlight was on, tucking the blankets just right. As Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, Caleb looked smaller than usual against his pillows, more vulnerable. The sight made Ethan's throat tight with emotion. "Dad?" Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, buddy? I'm scared." Ethan leaned down, pressing his forehead against his son's. "Me too," he admitted softly. "But being scared doesn't mean we give up. It means we fight harder." Caleb's hand found his, squeezing tight. "Like you did in the army? Like we'll do together." Ethan tucked the blanket more securely around his son's shoulders. "We'll fight this, son. I promise." The shadows crept across the living room walls as Ethan sat motionless in his old armchair. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m., each sound echoing in the quiet house. His phone lay face down on the coffee table, the official notice from CPS beside it. Its words burned into his memory. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow on the family photos arranged on the wall. Ethan's eyes fixed on one in particular, Caleb's 5th birthday, before Sarah got sick. His son's smile was so bright, so trusting. The same smile he'd seen today at the Veterans Day assembly, proud and full of hope. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Ethan whispered into the darkness. "I'm not enough for him." His mind tortured him with every misstep, every harsh word spoken in frustration, every time he'd worked late instead of being home. The factory calluses on his hands felt like badges of failure rather than honest work. The living room seemed to close in around him. Memories of Sarah haunted every corner, her favorite reading spot by the window, the worn patch on the carpet where she used to do her morning stretches. What would she think of him now? A father who couldn't even protect their son from school bullies, let alone the powerful forces trying to tear them apart. Dawn began to creep over the horizon when 3 sharp knocks broke through Ethan's dark thoughts. He knew that pattern. It was Luis's signature knock from their deployment days. Pushing himself up from the chair, his joints stiff from sitting all night, Ethan opened the door. Luis stood there in his work clothes, holding 2 large cups of coffee. Steam rose from them in the crisp morning air. brother," he said simply, his eyes taking in Ethan's exhausted face. "You look like hell." "Thanks for noticing." Ethan managed a weak smile, stepping aside to let his friend in. Luis set the coffees down on the kitchen counter and turned to face Ethan. "You didn't answer any of my calls last night." "I couldn't." Ethan's voice cracked. He gestured helplessly at the CPS notice. Luis picked up the paper, his jaw tightening as he read. "Theodore Whitaker." He practically spat the name. "That entitled piece of—" He caught himself, glancing toward the hallway where Caleb's room was. "This is low, even for him." "What am I supposed to do, Luis?" Ethan slumped against the counter. "He's got money, connections. I'm just a factory worker with—" He swallowed hard. "With a history." Luis's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's shoulder. "Stop right there. You're not just anything. You're a Green Beret. A father who's raised an incredible kid despite everything life's thrown at you. And you're not alone. The system's rigged. Then we'll fight the system." Luis interrupted, pulling out his phone. "Marcus and Daniel are already on their way. We're not letting this stand." As if on cue, 2 more quiet knocks came at the door. Marcus and Daniel entered, both carrying notebooks and laptops. They moved with the quiet efficiency that came from years of military training, setting up at the kitchen table like it was a mission briefing. "First thing," Marcus said, opening his laptop, "we document everything. Every incident of bullying, every time the school looked the other way." Daniel's wife is a paralegal. She's already pulling records. Daniel nodded, his fingers flying over his keyboard. "The Whitakers have a history of using their money to silence people, but they've never gone up against a brotherhood like ours." Luis pulled out his own notebook. "I've got names of teachers who've witnessed the bullying but were afraid to speak up. Plus, that Veterans Day speech? Several parents recorded it. We'll show exactly what kind of father you are, Ethan." Ethan watched his brother's work, feeling something stir in his chest, something that had been dormant since he'd opened that envelope. "Hope, we're taking this public," Luis continued. "No more letting them hide behind closed doors and private meetings. The whole town needs to see what's happening." "The whole town?" Ethan hesitated. "Caleb's already been through so much." "Your son is stronger than you think." Marcus looked up from his laptop. "Yesterday, he stood in front of hundreds of people and spoke about honor and courage. He's his father's son." The men worked through the early morning hours, their coffee growing cold as they built their strategy. They compiled evidence, drafted statements, and mapped out every connection the Whitakers had used to maintain their influence over the town. As the sun rose fully, casting warm light through the kitchen windows, Ethan felt his strength returning. These men, his brothers, had never left him behind on the battlefield, and they weren't about to start now. What none of them noticed was the small shadow in the hallway. Caleb stood silently, listening to every word. He watched his father's shoulders straighten, heard the determination return to his voice. His hand touched the spot where his mother's photo rested in his pocket, a ritual that had always given him comfort. But now, watching these strong men rally around his father, Caleb felt a new kind of strength growing inside him. He wouldn't let his father fight this battle alone. He wouldn't let fear win. Most importantly, he wouldn't let the Whitakers tear apart what remained of his family. As the morning light grew stronger, Caleb's resolve grew with it. His father had taught him about courage, not through words, but through actions. Now it was his turn to be brave. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Luis and Ethan walked into Eleanor's diner. The bell above the door chimed, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. Eleanor herself, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "Ethan Carter," she said warmly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Haven't seen you in here for a while." Luis guided them to a quiet booth in the corner, away from other customers. Eleanor followed with a pot of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "We heard about what happened with your boy," Eleanor said quietly, glancing around. "That Mason kid and his daddy have been nothing but trouble since they moved here 5 years ago." Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sank into the seat beside them, her voice barely above a whisper. "That man, Mr. Richardson, he bought up half the downtown properties, tripled the rent on most of us small business owners." She dabbed at her eyes with her apron. 3 shops closed last month alone. My lease is up for renewal next week, and I'm scared, Ethan. This diner's been in my family for 40 years. Marcus and Daniel joined them, settling into the booth with notebooks ready. Over the next hour, Eleanor's story poured out. She wasn't alone. Other shop owners started dropping by, each with their own tale of intimidation and financial pressure. The veterans split up, covering different parts of town. At the local hardware store, the owner, Jim Peterson, showed them threatening letters from Richardson's lawyers. "All because I wouldn't sell," he explained, his weathered face tight with anger. He wanted to build some fancy shopping complex. At the school, a young teacher named Miss Rodriguez met them in the parking lot after hours. Her eyes darted nervously as she handed over a USB drive. "Security camera footage," she whispered. "Shows Mason and his friends cornering Caleb that day. I tried to report it, but the principal." She shrugged helplessly. "My contract wasn't renewed for next year." Days blurred together as they gathered more evidence. Daniel, who now worked as an IT specialist, recovered deleted social media posts showing Mason's systematic bullying of other students. Marcus, with his law enforcement background, documented each testimony meticulously. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The school janitor, Mr. Washington, approached Louise one afternoon. "Been here 30 years, he said, leaning on his mop. "Seen a lot of kids come and go. But what they did to your boy, Mr. Carter?" He shook his head. "Got it all on my phone. Was cleaning near the lockers that day. Couldn't stop it fast enough. But I recorded it. Been keeping it. Waiting for someone brave enough to stand up." The video was clearer than the viral version, showing Mason and his friends surrounding Caleb. It captured their faces, their words, their deliberate cruelty. More importantly, it showed teachers walking past, seeing the situation, and turning away. Word spread quietly through the town. More people came forward. A grocery store clerk, a postal worker, a nurse from the local clinic. Each had a story about the Richardsons. Each offered their support. Some brought documents, others shared recordings. Many simply wanted to tell their truth. By week's end, Luis's dining room table was covered with evidence. Statements, photographs, videos, financial records, and letters. The veterans worked late into the night, organizing everything into a compelling case that even Richardson's expensive lawyers couldn't dismiss. On Friday evening, Ethan walked through his front door, exhausted but hopeful. The house smelled of pasta sauce, and he found Caleb in the kitchen, carefully stirring a pot of spaghetti. "Thought you might be hungry," Caleb said, looking up with a small smile. "Uncle Luis showed me how to make this yesterday." Ethan's throat tightened as he watched his son confidently drain the pasta and plate their dinner. They sat together at their small kitchen table, the same one where they'd shared so many quiet meals in the past year, each lost in their own grief and fears. But tonight felt different. Caleb twirled spaghetti around his fork, then looked up at his father. "Jenny from school told me her mom is going to speak up at the meeting. And Tommy's dad, too." He paused, his eyes bright. "They're not afraid anymore, Dad, because of you." Ethan shook his head. "Not just me, son. It's everyone together. Sometimes it takes one person to start, but it takes a community to finish." Caleb put down his fork and reached across the table, placing his hand over his father's. "I'm proud of you, Dad." The words hung in the air between them, filling their small kitchen with something that felt a lot like hope. Father and son sat there in comfortable silence, sharing a simple meal that tasted more like victory than any fancy dinner ever could. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Carter home, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. Ethan stood at the counter, mechanically stirring his coffee while watching Caleb in the backyard. His son sat cross-legged on the grass, sketching in his notebook. A morning ritual that had become more frequent since the veterans had started helping them. The sharp ring of his cell phone cut through the peaceful moment. Ethan glanced at the screen, not recognizing the number, and answered. "Mr. Carter." The voice was smooth, cultured, and cold as winter steel. "This is Richard Whitaker. I believe we should have a conversation about your recent activities." Ethan's hand tightened around his coffee mug. Mason's father, the billionaire who'd been trying to tear his family apart. "I'm listening," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady despite the sudden thundering of his heart. "Let's be direct," Whitaker continued. "Your little crusade with your military friends needs to end. Now, I've been patient, but you're becoming a nuisance." Ethan watched Caleb through the window, remembering how his son's shoulders had straightened over the past weeks, how his smile had slowly returned. A nuisance. Ethan's voice was quiet. Your son bullied mine, posted videos, made his life hell. Boys will be boys, Mr. Carter. Whitaker's tone dripped with condescension. But what you're doing could have serious consequences. I have friends in many places, the factory where you work, the bank holding your mortgage, the family court system. One word from me. The threat hung in the air like poison. Ethan's stomach churned. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, it could all disappear. His hands began to shake, and he set the coffee mug down before he could drop it. Think about your son, Whitaker pressed. Do you really want to risk losing him over this? The words hit Ethan like physical blows. His breath caught in his throat as fear, cold and familiar, crept up his spine. Maybe he should back down. Maybe the risk was too high. Maybe. Then he remembered Caleb's words from just days ago. Dad, you always said courage means standing tall even when you're scared. The front door opened, and Luis walked in, using the spare key Ethan had given him. One look at Ethan's face, and his friend's expression turned serious. Mr. Whitaker, Ethan said, drawing strength from Luis's presence. My son is exactly why I won't stop. You think you can threaten me because you have money and power? But I've faced things that would make you shake in your expensive shoes. You're making a terrible mistake, Whitaker hissed. No, you made the mistake when you taught your son it was okay to hurt others. When you decided money could buy dignity. We're not backing down. You'll regret this, Carter. Ethan ended the call, his hand trembling but his spine straight. Luis stepped forward, concern etched on his features. Whitaker, Luis asked quietly. Ethan nodded, running a hand through his hair. He threatened everything. My job, my house, custody of Caleb. Maybe I'm being selfish, putting Caleb at risk just to prove a point. Luis's hand gripped his shoulder, firm and steady. Brother, we've faced worse enemies with less. This fight is worth it. That man needs to learn he can't buy people's souls. Through the window, they watched as Caleb looked up from his drawing, waving at them with a bright smile. The sight made Ethan's chest ache with love and determination. You're right, Ethan said. We're not giving up. He walked outside, crossing the yard to where Caleb sat surrounded by colored pencils and paper. His son's latest drawing showed a group of men in uniform standing together, the Green Berets who'd become their extended family. That's really good, buddy, Ethan said, lowering himself to the grass beside Caleb. Thanks, Dad. Caleb glanced up, his expression turning worried as he studied his father's face. Are you okay? You look upset. Ethan pulled his son into a tight embrace, feeling Caleb's arms wrap around him in return. The morning sun warmed their shoulders, and somewhere nearby, a bird sang its morning song. I'm more than okay, Ethan whispered. And I promise you, Caleb, I'm never giving up again. Not ever. Caleb hugged him tighter, and in that moment, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that no amount of money or threats could break what truly mattered. The bond between a father and son, the strength of brotherhood, and the power of standing up for what was right. Through the kitchen window, Luis watched them with a proud smile, already pulling out his phone to rally the other veterans. The battle lines had been drawn, and they would face whatever came next together. The school auditorium buzzed with tension as people filed in, filling every seat. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the crowd. Parents in work clothes who'd rushed straight from their jobs, teachers with worried expressions, and students who sensed something important was about to happen. In the front row, Mason Whitaker slouched between his parents, his father's expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual attire around them. Near the back, Sergeant Luis Morales and 3 other Green Berets stood like sentinels, their presence commanding respect without a word. They wore civilian clothes, but their military bearing was unmistakable. Each carried a folder thick with documents. Caleb Carter sat between his father and Luis, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Ethan reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder, drawing strength from the touch as much as giving it. The school board president, Mrs. Henderson, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Our first item of business tonight concerns the recent allegations of bullying and misconduct at Marshall Middle School. Mr. Carter has requested to address the board. Ethan stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The room fell silent as he walked to the podium, his footsteps echoing in the hushed space. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began speaking in a voice that carried years of command experience. "I'm not here tonight to make accusations or demand revenge," he started, his tone measured and clear. "I'm here as a father who wants his son, and every child in this school, to feel safe and respected." Richard Whitaker shifted in his seat, his face a mask of controlled disdain. But Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. "For months, my son Caleb has endured systematic bullying. Not just teasing, but humiliation, physical intimidation, and public shame. We tried handling this through proper channels. We were ignored. Today, that changes." Luis and the other Green Berets moved forward, distributing packets to each board member. The rustling of papers filled the room as people began to examine the evidence, screenshots, written testimonies, and photographs. "But the most compelling evidence," Ethan continued, nodding to Luis, "is this." The lights dimmed, and a projector flickered to life. The video that had haunted Caleb played on the wall. Mason and his friends surrounding him after the talent show, their cruel laughter echoing through the speakers. But this time, the video didn't stop there. It continued, showing other incidents: pushed books, tripped feet, stolen lunch money, all carefully documented by security cameras and student phones. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson's face grew pale as she watched. Richard Whitaker stood up abruptly, but Luis and another veteran stepped forward, their presence a silent warning to remain seated. The lights came back on, and Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs. "This isn't just about Caleb. We've gathered statements from 15 other students who faced similar treatment. Their parents were afraid to speak up, fearing retaliation from those with influence. That ends tonight." The crowd erupted in scattered applause, growing louder as more people joined in. Parents began standing up, sharing their own children's stories. Teachers who had stayed silent now spoke about the pressure they'd faced to ignore the bullying. Mason sank lower in his seat, his usual swagger replaced by genuine fear as the tide of public opinion turned against him. His father's face had turned an angry red, but he remained silent, aware of the cameras recording the meeting. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitaker, would you and your son like to address these allegations?" Richard Whitaker stood, straightening his tie. "This is clearly a coordinated attack on my family's reputation. These so-called veterans—" "Sir," Luis interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Every document in those packets is verified. Every video authenticated. Every witness ready to testify. You can fight this, but you'll lose more than just your reputation." The room fell silent again. Richard Whitaker looked around, seeing not the usual deference but determination in the faces before him. His shoulders sagged slightly, the first crack in his armor. Mason looked up at his father, then at Caleb. Something shifted in his expression, fear giving way to shame. Without waiting for his father's permission, he stood up. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. What I did, what we did to Caleb, it was wrong." The crowd watched as Mason walked to where Caleb Saturday. His friends, seeing their leader break rank, followed. One by one, they knelt before Caleb, offering genuine apologies. "I was jealous," Mason admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You had real courage at the talent show. Your dad, he's a real hero. I just pretended to be important." The audience erupted in applause and cheers. Parents hugged their children. Teachers wiped away tears. The Green Berets stood at attention, pride evident in their bearing. Ethan moved through the crowd to his son. He placed his hands on Caleb's shoulders, both of them trembling with relief and pride. Caleb looked up at his father, his eyes shining with unshed tears and newfound strength. The school board president's gavel rang out again. "In light of this evidence, the board will take immediate action to implement anti-bullying measures and investigate all instances of administrative negligence. Mr. Carter, thank you for your courage in bringing this forward." Richard Whitaker and his wife slipped out a side door, their influence in the community effectively ended. But Mason stayed, standing awkwardly near Caleb, as if uncertain how to navigate this new reality where money didn't determine worth. The Green Berets gathered around Ethan and Caleb, forming a protective circle of honor and loyalty. Luis squeezed Ethan's shoulder, tears in his eyes. "Mission accomplished, brother." The moving trucks appeared before dawn, their diesel engines humming in the misty morning air. Workers filed in and out of the Whitaker mansion like ants, carrying expensive furniture and carefully wrapped artwork. The grand estate that had once loomed over the town like a crown now seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the scandal that had brought down its owners. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as cardboard boxes were loaded into the trucks. Mrs. Henderson from the local diner whispered to anyone who'd listen that the estate was already listed with a real estate agency in the city. The asking price had been slashed. The Whitakers were clearly in a hurry to leave. Mason hadn't returned to school since the board meeting. Rumor had it the family was relocating to Europe, though no one knew for sure. The boy who had once strutted through the halls like he owned them had vanished without saying goodbye to anyone. Principal Roberts called Ethan into her office on a sunny Tuesday morning. The same office where she had once dismissed his concerns about bullying now felt different. Humbler, perhaps. She sat behind her desk, hands folded, a different woman than the one who had kowtowed to wealth and influence. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "We've been doing a lot of thinking about how to prevent what happened with Mason from ever happening again." She paused, shuffling some papers on her desk. "We need someone who understands discipline, respect, and most importantly, courage. Someone who can mentor our troubled students." Ethan sat straighter in his chair, his expression curious but guarded. "We'd like to offer you a part-time position," she continued. 3 afternoons a week, working with boys who need guidance. The kind of guidance only someone with your experience can provide. The principal laid out the details. The hours would work around his factory schedule, and the pay, while modest, would help ease their financial strain. But it was more than that. It was a chance to turn their painful experience into something meaningful. "You won't be alone," she added. "Sergeant Morales has already agreed to volunteer 1 afternoon a week." Ethan thought about the boys like Mason, privileged but lost, and the boys like Caleb, good hearts needing only confidence to shine. He thought about his own journey from soldier to father, and how sometimes the hardest battles were fought not with weapons, but with wisdom and compassion. "I'd be honored," he said simply. The changes in Caleb were remarkable to watch. The boy who had once hunched his shoulders and avoided eye contact now walked the school halls with quiet confidence. Other students began to gravitate toward him, drawn not by fear or force, but by the genuine strength he projected. During lunch periods, Caleb could often be found sitting with kids who reminded Ethan of his former self, the shy ones, the ones who didn't quite fit in. He'd share his sandwich with a classmate who forgot their lunch, or help another with math homework. The same gentle spirit that had once made him a target now made him a natural leader. One afternoon, Ethan watched through his office window as Caleb intervened when 2 boys were about to fight. He didn't raise his voice or threaten. He just stepped between them, spoke quietly, and somehow got them both to laugh. The scene brought tears to Ethan's eyes. In his new role, Ethan found himself working with boys from all backgrounds. Some were angry, some scared, some lost. He taught them the same lessons his Green Beret brothers had taught Caleb, about standing tall, about using words before fists, about the difference between true strength and mere power. The factory still took up most of his days, but now the work felt lighter somehow. The double shifts didn't exhaust him the way they used to. Having a purpose beyond survival made everything else manageable. On a crisp Saturday morning, Ethan drove to the cemetery, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. The headstone was simple: Sarah Carter, beloved wife and mother. He knelt before it, brushing away some fallen leaves. "You should see him, Sarah," he said softly, placing the flowers against the cool stone. "Our boy. He's becoming everything we hoped he'd be. Strong, but kind. Brave, but gentle." He paused, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "The kind of man who makes others better just by being around them." A warm breeze rustled the trees overhead, carrying the sweet scent of autumn leaves. "We're safe now," he continued. "Really safe. Not just from bullies or rich men who think they own the world, but inside too." He touched the headstone gently. "I wish you could see how the whole town has changed. How people look out for each other now. How your son helped make that happen." Ethan sat there for a while, telling Sarah about Caleb's latest achievements, his improving grades, his growing circle of friends, the way younger students looked up to him. He told her about his new role at the school, about the boys he was helping, about the healing that was happening not just in their family, but in the whole community. "You'd be proud," he whispered, standing slowly. "So proud." As he walked back to his truck, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The morning sun warmed his face, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying across the peaceful cemetery. The sound reminded him of hope, of new beginnings, of battles won not with force but with faith and perseverance. The autumn evening painted the town square in warm golden hues as strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed overhead like a canopy of stars. The annual harvest festival was in full swing, with the scent of caramel apples and grilled corn floating on the crisp breeze. Ethan Carter walked beside his son Caleb, both dressed in comfortable sweaters, their steps matching as they made their way through the cheerful crowd. "Mr. Carter," called Mrs. Thompson from the pie stand, waving enthusiastically. "We saved you boys some apple pie. Still warm." Ethan smiled, noting how different it felt now when people called his name. There was warmth in their voices, respect in their eyes. Gone were the awkward glances and whispered conversations that had once followed them around town. "Looking sharp, Caleb," Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, called out. "Heard you're helping coach the junior choir now?" Caleb beamed, standing a little taller. "Yes, sir. We're practicing for the Christmas concert." They continued through the festival, stopping to chat with neighbors who had become friends. Children who had once avoided Caleb now called out to him, asking if he'd join their games later. The transformation wasn't lost on Ethan. His son walked with confidence now, his smile genuine and bright. "There they are!" A familiar voice boomed across the square. Luis Morales appeared, flanked by Marcus and Daniel, all three veterans carrying paper plates piled high with festival food. "Uncle Luis!" Caleb rushed forward, accepting a warm one-armed hug from the former Green Beret. "We couldn't miss this," Marcus grinned, ruffling Caleb's hair. "Especially not after hearing you might sing tonight." Daniel nodded toward the small stage where local musicians were setting up. "The sign-up sheet's got your name on it, kid. You ready to show them how it's done?" Caleb glanced at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I've been practicing," he said, his voice steady with newfound assurance. The group found a table near the stage, sharing stories and laughter over plates of festival food. Luis told carefully edited war stories that had Caleb hanging on every word. Marcus's wife joined them with their young daughter, who insisted on sitting next to Caleb, clearly starstruck by the boy who had stood up to bullies and won. As evening deepened, the festival lights grew brighter, casting a magical glow over the gathering. When the MC called Caleb's name, the crowd erupted in supportive cheers. Ethan watched his son climb the steps to the stage, remembering how different it had been at the school talent show months ago. Caleb took his place at the microphone, his hands steady. The opening notes of "Lean on Me" filled the square, and Caleb's clear voice rose strong and true. There was no trembling now, no fear. He sang with the confidence of someone who knew he belonged. People swayed to the music, some singing along softly. Ethan felt Luis's hand squeeze his shoulder, saw Daniel wiping suspiciously at his eyes. When Caleb finished, the applause was thunderous and genuine, not a single mocking voice in the crowd. As Caleb made his way back to their table, the band struck up a slower song. Families moved to the dance area, and Ethan stood, extending his hand to his son. "May I have this dance?" he asked with exaggerated formality that made Caleb laugh. They stepped onto the dance floor together, Ethan leading as he had once led Caleb's mother. They moved in simple circles, sometimes stepping on each other's toes and chuckling about it. Other dancers smiled at them, the father and son who had shown the town what real strength looked like. "Remember when you taught me to slow dance for Mom's birthday?" Caleb asked softly. "In the living room?" "She loved watching us practice," Ethan replied, his voice thick with memory but not heavy with sadness anymore. "She'd be so proud of you, son, so proud of who you've become." They danced through another song, comfortable in their shared silence. The Green Berets watched from their table, raising their cups in a quiet toast to the family they had helped protect. Around them, the festival continued its cheerful celebration. Children running with sparklers, couples sharing cotton candy, neighbors greeting neighbors with genuine warmth. As the music faded, the first boom of fireworks drew everyone's attention skyward. Ethan and Caleb found a spot on the grass, leaning back to watch the display. Red, gold, and blue flowers bloomed against the dark canvas of night, reflecting in their upturned faces. In the brief quiet between explosions, Ethan pulled his son close. "We're home now, son," he whispered. "Truly home." Caleb nestled against his father's shoulder, his face illuminated by another burst of color above. The fireworks continued their joyful dance across the sky, celebrating more than just a festival. They celebrated a father and son who had found their place, a community that had learned to stand together, and the simple truth that love and courage could light up even the darkest nights. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.